4 years. We're going to hit our 4th anniversary at the end of this month. And it's a weekly audio podcast all about Boston history through the centuries. Before I did that, I was a volunteer docent for the Shirley Eustace House in Roxbury, and a Boston tour guide for a couple of years. And let me put up a slide with some of the info about the podcast as means of introduction. There we go. So you can find us at hubhistory.com. That'll show you all the ways to subscribe to the show. We have over 200 past episodes available on the site. And then pick your social media poison. We're on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram as Hub History. I personally am most active on Twitter, so that's where you can follow me every day if you want to. And as the introduction said, we are winning an award next Thursday from the Boston Preservation Alliance, which, thanks to these COVID times, that'll be live streamed. So anybody who wants to can go to bostonpreservation.org and see how to attend that. If you just love tonight's presentation, you want to see more of us, that's how you can do it. So again, no matter how you like to get your podcasts, we're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon, you name an app, we're going to be there. If we're not there, tell me so I can make sure that we get there. So to kick us off, about 2 years ago, I got an email through the contact form on our podcast website from a guy named Dan, who was going to come visit Boston, and he was very interested in the smugglers' tunnels of the North End. So if you've spent any time in the North End, if you've taken a tour, if you've lived there, no matter how you've been through the North End, you've probably heard some sort of rumor about secret tunnels under the streets of the North End. They get called the pirate tunnels, the smugglers' tunnels. Sometimes they incorporate stories about the cherubs that are above the organ at Old North. They say that the pirate Captain Gruchy smuggled them in through these secret underground tunnels. So that's a story I've heard for decades now. It's a story that in my tour guide days, I was known to repeat. And Dan's email finally inspired me to go look for some sources. Dan wanted to know, he was going to visit Boston. He wanted to see if he could get a detailed map of Gruchy's secret tunnels. Wanted to know if tourists could go in the tunnels, and could he get a guided tour of the tunnels? Of course, the answer to all those things was no, but it got my curiosity up. So I went on a hunt for information about the tunnels. I think the popularity of some of the rumors about the tunnels started to peak the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, and really took off with it was featured in the media through H.P. Lovecraft, who was a horror writer. He's never really been my cup of tea. Writes these sort of weird, borderline sci-fi horror stories. And I'm not a horror guy. But Lovecraft is having a moment right now. There's a new TV show on HBO called Lovecraft Country. So everything that's old is new again. But in 1927, he published a short story called Pickman's Model. And you can see I put up some of the different editions of Pickman's Model, what the cover art looks like. It gives you a little bit of a flavor of who H.P. Lovecraft was and his twisted mind. So in this story, Pickman's Model, Pickman is a Boston artist, and he paints these weird, terrifying, supernatural pictures of werewolves and demons, these fantastic monsters. With this spoiler alert for a 100-year-old story. The twist ending is that they're not just fantasies from this painter's mind, they're the actual monsters he sees coming out of the tunnels in his basement in the North End. So I'm just going to share a relevant passage, and let me get my controls over here. So let me just take this down for, have I not been sharing this whole time as I said I was sharing?
You've been sharing, no worries.
Okay, good. All right, I'm going to pause sharing for a moment. I'm going to read a passage from Pickman's Model. So this is in the voice of Pickman. He says, "I'll wager my 4 times great-grandmother could have told you things. things. They hanged her on Gallows Hill, with Cotton Mather looking sanctimoniously on. Mather, damn him, was afraid somebody might succeed in kicking free of this accursed cage of monotony. I wish someone had laid a spell on him or sucked his blood in the night. I can show you a house he lived in, and I can show you another one he was afraid to enter despite all his fine bold talk. He knew things he dared not put into that stupid Magnalia or the puerile wonders of the invisible world, which those are Cotton Mather's two most famous works, and it's funny to see them dismissed so suddenly. Look here, do you know the whole North End once had a set of tunnels that kept certain people in touch with each other's houses, with the burying ground, and with the sea. Let them prosecute and persecute above ground. Things went on every day that they couldn't reach, and voices laughed at night that they couldn't place. Why, out of 10 surviving houses built before 1700 and not moved since, I'll wager that in 8, I can show you something queer in the cellar. And he says there's hardly a month that you don't read of a workman finding bricked up arches and wells that lead nowhere. So it's definitely in the public imagination, starting in this period around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. And because so much legend and fiction gets built up around the idea of these tunnels, I initially thought that they were pure fiction. They were an entirely made-up phenomenon. But then I went looking a little deeper, and I started to find some evidence. So let me get this guy up here. So this is a clip from the Boston Globe on September 6th, 1896, with a story about what they were calling the North End subway. And of course, what's going on in 1896, it's the building of the first in the nation subway system, starting with the Boylston Street subway from Park Street to Boylston Station. So there's a lot of interest in tunnels and underground happenings. And tucked away it was not anywhere close to the front page of the Globe, but tucked in the back page of the Globe, you have this story about the North End subway. Some nice illustrations, and it says, long before the present subway commission was thought of, and before the crush of horse and electric cars made the city streets so dangerous for pedestrians that it became a necessity to put them underground, someone found it for his interest to build a subway in the heart of what was then the center of the city. Why it was built or when is a mystery, but that it exists, many at the North End know. So, okay, we have evidence of tunnels, things under the ground in the North End. Now, as a side note, I think it's interesting right around this same time, yes, there's a lot of interest in what's going on underground, but the underground is viewed with revulsion. That's where rats and snakes come from. It's where sewage and dead bodies go to. It's where the devil lives. It's where germs that people don't understand come from, evil spirits. So the subway itself is very controversial. The proposal, the ballot measure to build the subway only passed by about 1,200 votes. That's a pretty tight margin. And there's a very active anti-subway league who advertise things like the subway microbe, these hideous germs that were going to be found living underground. Historian Charlie Bainey said that the underground was seen as the realm of Lucifer himself, inhabited by lost souls, moldering corpses, strange forms of animal life, and noxious vapors. So while there's interest around the turn of the 20th century, there's also a whole lot of hesitation about what's underground, including these supposed tunnels in the North End. So moving from the 19th century from the turn of the 20th century into the turn of the 21st, the stories have blown completely out of control. So in more recent times, everybody has a story about having talked to an old timer in the North End, and the old timer, or maybe their parents or an acquaintance of like their grandparents' generation, was in the tunnels or saw the tunnels or somehow experienced the tunnels. And that's the claim that well-meaning tour guides, folks like me a few years ago, would have repeated. It gets printed lots of places. So if you do a search for North End tunnels, there's no end of variations on the story. So I just grabbed a couple of local ones. The folklorist is a TV show from New TV, which I believe is like Newton Public Access, and northendboston.com local blog. So people think that somebody they know has experienced the tunnels. So in the North End blog, they ask an old timer, did anybody ever go into the tunnel? And a character, an older gentleman in the neighborhood named Sonny, says, well, yes, that's what I've been told. Before my grandfather had it bricked up. So we're already the old timers, grandfather's generation. People went inside. They even found an old rusted sword. So they found an artifact, but it's been sold. So they don't have the artifact in hand. And he says that this tunnel was part of a network of tunnels. One ran over to the crypt at Old North and went off under Copp's Hill burying ground. The main tunnel went up Salem Street under Charter, then down to Grushie's Wharf. So that becomes a very common claim. If you do your favorite search engine search for North End tunnels, this is what comes up, that there is a network of tunnels in the North End. And that's what the folklorist says. He says that a writer in 1817 mentioned a possible tunnel under a house on Lynn Street. And the AIA guide, the American Institute of Architects guide, reports a historic house on Salem Street with a bricked up archway. So my crude map making abilities. We have somebody claiming Lynn Street, which is way over here to the west, near almost over to Haymarket. There's somebody talking about a tunnel under Salem Street. We have some mentions of a tunnel under Commercial Street. So peeling away the just obviously outlandish claims about tunnels connecting into crypts in the North End or crypts under the Copp's Hill burying ground or into the basement of Old North. Those are the three locations that crop up the most often in tales of tunnels in the North End. So let's see if we can figure out who built the tunnels, what they were built for, and where somebody might be able to find them today. So I'm going to start, the folklorist mentioned an 1817 source. So let's start with his 1817 source. So I'm putting up a quote from Charles Shaw, who was a historian, and this is the earliest written description of the tunnels that I'm aware of in like a book of history. So it's from his 1817 Topographical and Historical Description of Boston. And there's a whole little mini chapter called The Ancient Arch. He says, there has been noted an arch of more than common dimensions in Lynn Street on the north side, take that one more time. On the north side, communicating with a cellar, which is under a house demolished in the year 1775 to 1776 during the British occupation. On the side next to the Charles River, it was on a level with the wharf, which formerly ran into the river. The arch had the same width as the house. It was continued under the street to the cellar wall of the building on the southern side of the street. So that's pretty specific in detail. That's not somebody claiming that their grandfather's grandfather saw something maybe in a basement one time. So casting our net a little wider, we have 1873 Samuel Adams Drake in the Old Landmarks and Historic Personages of Boston. He talks about a Lynn Street tunnel, and it's on the corner with Henchman Lane, which is a name I will never get tired of. And he says, at the foot of Henchman's Lane, when the work of excavation was proceeding at this point, there was uncovered an arch built of brick of large dimensions with an opening at the water side. Describes how the topography was originally high bank. And the arch spanning the then Lynn Street and communicating with the cellar on the house on the north side. About 40 years ago, when digging for the foundation of the houses on the east side of the street, the remains of the arch were found and are still to be found in the cellar of the house opposite Henchman's Lane. Okay, well, I'll tell you in a minute why I take this with a grain of salt. I have some issues with Mr. Drake, but we'll come back to those. Drake was a journalist. He was a Civil War veteran. He wrote something like 20-ish books, most of which were histories of Boston or the Boston area. And very confusingly, he was also the son of a Samuel Drake. His father was Samuel Gardner Drake. His father also published books on Boston history. So I always have to be very careful with which Samuel Drake I'm talking about when we do these things. And then this is the third of the, I'll come back to each of these sources a couple of times. This is the third source I want to look at as far as books of history. So this is 1887, Edward Griffin Porter. Porter was a Harvard man. He was a minister. He founded the Hancock Trinitarian Congregational Church out in Lexington. But along with being a minister, he was a pretty serious historian. He was a member of the Mass Historical Society, the American Historical Association, American Antiquarian Society, and several other historical groups. He was a real historian. And Rambles in Old Boston, this volume was his most influential book, but he published at least 3 others along with contributing a lot of journal articles. So he was somebody who knew his Boston history. So Charles Shaw, Samuel Adams Drake both talked about Lynn Street. So let's see what Mr. Porter has to say. So Porter says that on the water side of Commercial Street, leading from the cellar of the house at number 453, is a singular and somewhat mysterious arch. And he includes an illustration, which is nice for our imagination's sake. So there's a singular and somewhat mysterious arch about which there is yet abundant room for speculation. Rises from stone springing, so sort of the stone foundation, built of large imported brick laid in the English bond. So large imported, it's about 5 feet high, 14 feet wide. The bottom's level, like some of the streets in Rome. It's evidently been raised by the gradual accumulation of rubbish by its long use as a receptacle for wood and coal. Again, very specific claims. Sounds like somebody who might have seen something or talked to somebody who saw something first time. He describes it as not being at right angles with the house, but bearing off in the direction of Salem Street. Okay. The other historian who talks a lot about North End tunnels is Edward Rowe Snow. And I bet a lot of you remember Edward Rowe Snow. He was a real character. He wrote dozens. I went, when preparing for this, to try to find a comprehensive list of all the books he had written. He wrote a lot of books about, a lot of it's maritime history, maritime adventures. He writes about Boston Harbor, the Harbor Islands, pirates, historical storms, shipwrecks, buried treasure. His first book was The Islands of Boston Harbor in 1935. Then he went off, he served as an airman with the Army Air Corps in World War II, after which he became the Flying Santa, where he would take a small plane. In early years, a small plane. In later years, before he retired, he was in a helicopter. And he would go to all the lighthouses on the New England coast and drop gifts for the families. He had a weekly radio show that was mostly geared toward kids. He was a very frequent guest on local TV shows once TV was invented. So this photo that I'm borrowing from an independent researcher named Richard Dean, who I'll talk more about in a couple of minutes, shows him in the basement of a house on Salem Street. He's resting his house very meaningfully on this arch feature in the basement, gazing at it, very concentrated sort of look there. On the right is the same arch. That's a photo taken in 1930 by a photographer named Leon Abdalian. And in his collection in the BPL, it's captioned as the entrance to a tunnel at 190 Salem Street. All right, coming back to my crudely thrown together map for 1 second, we have Commercial Street all the way in the northeast corner, Salem Street dead center, Lynn Street sort of off to the southwest, right? But if we go to, there we go. If we go to our Bonner map of Boston, so this is a 1722 map of Boston. I will say that unhelpfully, north is sort of cockeyed to our right. So imagine the map of Boston tilted up somewhat. But I tried to magnify a little section in the middle to illustrate that what we now know as Commercial Street was once Lynn Street. So that's going to collapse the number of possibilities we're dealing with. So you can see it's labeled Lynn Street here along the water. It also shows us a couple of other things. It shows us that if we go to Porter's description, that the tunnel was under Commercial Street and angled toward Salem Street. So we're going from Lynn Street, angling toward Salem Street, not quite following right up Henchman's Lane, but almost. We can pretty quickly conclude that all three of those descriptions we just read are actually talking about the same place. So the description of Lynn Street, well, Lynn Street becomes Commercial Street. The description of a tunnel under Salem Street, well, it's probably connecting through at least to or near Salem Street. All these references are pointing to the same thing. You can probably hear it in my voice. I'm a little bit skeptical of Salem Street, and especially that archway that we saw Edward Rossno standing in front of. I think there may be some other explanations for that. But even if it went all the way up to 190 Salem Street, that's a distance of at most about 300 feet. And I suspect it was actually quite a bit smaller than that. All right, so let's take a look. We basically know now where the North End Tunnel or tunnels were. Let's take a minute to investigate who built them and what they might have been built for. So we're going back here to Shaw in 1817, and he's going to attribute the North End tunnels to a merchant named Cheever. So in examining the ruins of that part of the town, I accidentally went into it. How do you accidentally go into a tunnel? Okay. Being struck with its unusual situation and size, I made inquiry of an aged friend. Another aged friend pops up. So we're going to the elders for all our explanations. This aged friend informed me that he had long known of the arch. The estate formerly belonged to a merchant named Cheever, who was a ruling elder at one of the churches in the North End, and been suspected of having concern in the smuggling trade. And this was very convenient because the arch went directly to his wharf. When it was constructed, he couldn't tell us. All right, so there's another claim about the tunnels, the arches. We'll start to see the tunnels referred to a lot as the arches here. So we're talking about a merchant named Cheever. So Shaw's aged friend was almost definitely talking about William Cheever, who we see over here on the right. And that picture was painted, I believe, when he was in his, I want to say 40s, which he doesn't look like a man in his 40s there. That's from the collection of the Mass Historical Society. So Cheever is originally from Monotony. He's a Harvard graduate, graduated 1771. His father's also William Cheever, William Downs Cheever. He was really built a business as a merchant in the North End. He had a house very near to where Haymarket is now. So the younger William, we know him, if you've heard of him, you probably know William Cheever as a diarist. So he kept a diary from inside occupied Boston during the siege year, 1775, 1776. And the last entry in his diary is Evacuation Day. So there are tons of American sources about the Revolution, the siege of Boston from sources outside Boston. There are only a handful from inside, and Cheever's diary is one, so that's kind of neat. The younger William, he was definitely active with his father's business in Boston. He would, after evacuation, a couple years after Evacuation Day, spend time in Amsterdam. So he basically managed the European end of the trading house. Came back to Boston in 1784. He bought a house at Battery and Commercial Streets, which you can see. If I can find my mouse pointer, you can see the Battery right here. If I go back, see the Battery down here, so Battery and Commercial. So the elder Cheever's business was too far inland to benefit from a smuggler's tunnel. He was, like I say, almost to Blackstone Street. The younger Cheever, first of all, he's gone for a long time, but also his house is about 3 blocks away from the tunnel, at least where we've located the tunnel through our research so far. And when he gets back to Boston, you know, so many of the more speculative histories say that the smugglers' tunnels were used to avoid paying the king's duties. And of course, when he comes back in 1784, after the end of the revolution, there's really no need to avoid the king's duties because we don't have a king anymore. So I'm dismissing Cheever as a source of the tunnels. So we're going to go back to Mr. Drake, Samuel Adams Drake, not Samuel Gardner Drake. I have to make that mental calculation each time. So he's going to repeat what is the most frequently, it's the most common theory about where the tunnel originated. So he says that time has disclosed that it was built by a Captain Gruchy during the French Wars and used for a place of deposit for captured goods. Perhaps he was a free trader or fitted out privateers to prey upon the commerce of the French king. Grushie was a subsequent owner of Sir William Phipps's house, his land running down the hill to the water's edge. He built himself a wharf of 2 captured vessels, which he sunk for the purpose. He goes on to say that these old arches were a unique feature of Old Boston, built at the time that Randolph made the attempt to collect the king's excise. Again, reason not to go for Cheever. Cheever didn't have to worry about the king's excise. Okay, so this brings us to my beef with Mr. Drake. He just couldn't say no to a good story. What I found in cross-checking Samuel Adams Drake against other historians is that if he had to choose between accuracy and a good story, he would choose the better narrative every time. And we're going to see that here. So he wrote stories, he wrote adventure stories for children, for young readers, and then he also wrote volumes like the one we were just quoting from that he considered serious history. So we're going to switch now to one of his children's books. This is from 1881, Around the Hub, a boy's book, very dated, about Boston. So he says, the rich silks, the spices and wines, the silver piastres and gold doubloons were disposed of in a more mysterious way. The privateering merchant built an underground arch of brick leading all the way from his house down to the beach. On the very first dark night after a vessel dropped anchor, his boats loaded with valuable booty pulled with muffled oars to the shore, where the goods were taken by the sailors up to the captain's house through the arch, lighted by flaring torches. The mouth of the arch, which was large enough for boats to enter, was concealed by a wharf running out into the river. So the king was cheated of his share. So it's a great story, very dramatically told. And I'll just stop for a minute and say this is an issue I also have with Edward Rowe Snow. I've read and enjoyed many of his books, but he also loved a good story more than he loved the truth. So you have to take it. I early, when we first started the podcast, I would repeat things that both Drake and Snow said uncritically. And now I take everything with a grain of salt. I try to find independent verification for anything either of them wrote. And Edward Rowe Snow had the additional problem that not only did he love a good story, but he also had media to fill. Between the TV appearances, the radio show, and all the books he was trying to write, he needed to come up with some stories. So he wasn't too critical about which ones he repeated. All right. So we can't trust Samuel Adams Drake. I said, well, I like to cross-check him against other sources. So let's see what a Reverend Porter, again, a serious historian, says in Rambles in Old Boston. So he describes a Jersey adventurer who cruises along the Spanish Main, captures valuable prizes, which he brings to Boston and sells to great advantage. Becoming rich, he concludes to make this his home and buys of John Ruck in 1745 the famous mansion of Sir William Phipps, which comes appointed with many nice features, ballrooms, guest chambers, servants, halls, coach house, stables, gardens, etc., etc. Having set up such an establishment, he has no difficulty in finding friends. His entertainments are gay and costly. He becomes one of the great men of the town, a benefactor of Christ Church, our host's Old North Church, a tithing man, a fire ward, a chairman of committees, and a subscriber to public improvements. He owns wharves at the foot of the hill. He buys Peter Butler's warehouse and Dumaresque's great distillery, extending his possessions along the shore by the old ferryway so that Grushie's Flats are still a nickname for the section today. All right. So I'm actually going to stop sharing for a minute and just talk about some of what we just saw in that passage. So he mentions this Jersey adventurer buying the famous mansion of Sir William Phipps. So I'll start there. In my mind, Sir William Phipps is a real contender for the title of most interesting man in the world, at least the most interesting man in colonial Boston. So Phipps is the first royal governor under the 1691 Charter of William and Mary, which I happen to notice today was the anniversary of William and Mary assenting to that charter. So happy second charter day. Phipps was a shepherd boy. He grew up on the Maine frontier, didn't have two pennies to rub against one another. He works in a lumber yard, then in a shipyard. He eventually moves down to Boston, starts working as a shipbuilder, and becomes the most wealthy man in North America because he found and raised silver from a sunken Spanish treasure ship in the Caribbean. So goes from penniless to richest man on the continent, comes back to Boston. It would be very easy for him then to support the status quo, but instead he makes this alliance with the Mather family, Cotton and Increase Mather, against Governor Andros, who's this hated royal governor who basically during the Dominion of New England, when our original charter was vacated, he was basically a personal rule through the king's crown rule. So Phipps is in alliance against Andros. After Andros is out, Phipps leads this foolhardy, ultimately very unsuccessful siege against Quebec in 1690 and comes back just in time to be the governor in charge of the Salem witch trials. So, like I say, a real contender for the most interesting man in the world. So, knowing that I take Porter a little more seriously, I feel that his account here is closer to the truth. And this Jersey adventurer he's talking about is Thomas Grushie. So if Grushie purchased the home of Sir William Phipps, who has passed through a couple owners' hands before it gets to Grushie, but Phipps was, again, incredibly rich. So to get his old home, Grushie must be a man of means. So where'd the money come from? So Grushie was a sea captain who hailed from Jersey. And that is Old Jersey, the Channel Island off the coast of England, not Chris Christie, New Jersey. Grushie, kind of similar to Phipps, came up from very modest means. He was the son of a ship's rigger, and he ended up going to sea at a pretty young age. I don't have an exact age, but as probably a teenager. So he shows up in Boston in 1741. He was already fairly well-to-do when he got here. He was well-to-do enough that he was able to purchase a box pew at Christ Church. Again, old. You can see our box pews here. So he did that within the first year of his arriving in Boston. So that, again, it's evidence that he was at least middle class, sort of upper middle class status to be able to afford a box pew. Then he's in Boston for about 3 years, and war breaks out between England and France in 1744. So this is King George's War. It's the third of our 4 so-called French and Indian Wars. So you have King William's, Queen Anne's, King George's, and then we just call it the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. For some reason, like calling it King George's War II or something didn't work out. So this is King George's War in 1744, the third of these wars. And unlike like we think about the 7 Years' War, what we went to school and learned of as the French and Indian War, that was the American extension of a war that was happening back in Europe. King George's War is basically a war that's fought on the North American continent, spills over into Europe a little bit, but it's mostly fought between France and England's American colonies. And who's that mean? It means Massachusetts folks. So there's this volunteer army of Massachusetts militia who go up to what's now Nova Scotia in 1745, and they lay siege to Louisbourg, which is like the Gibraltar of North America. It's the strongest fortress in all of North America at the time. And I won't go too far into it, but they get very lucky. They were aggressive in establishing a beachhead, so the French defenders weren't really able to hold the beach. They established this aggressive beachhead, and then the French in an outlying battery, what they called the Royal Battery, this stone fortress, but outside the main walls of the city, saw an advance party that was scouting, thought it was the main landing party. They abandoned the fortification. The Massachusetts militia takes right over. They turn the guns around on the city of Louisbourg. The siege lasts about a month and a half, and between naval artillery and the batteries that they're setting up on land with these guns they're dragging 2 miles through a swamp to set up a shore battery, they blast the walls into dust, and the French defenders surrender like a day before the attackers are about to rush their walls. So that's the map I have up here on the slide, is a map of Louisbourg with an inset of the landing there. So against all odds, this sort of ragtag militia army defeats the most feared fortress in North America. Now that's what's happening on the land. At sea, it's a privateer's war. So it was a way to harass the enemy shipping. So France is in league with the Spanish, so privateers are going to prey on French and Spanish shipping. Now, as the name imply, a lot of people probably already know this, but just quickly, a privateer means that it's a privately owned vessel that's fitted out for war. So it's armed, privately owned vessel, and they get a letter of marque, which is a document from their government, at this time from the monarch of their country, saying that they're authorized to attack vessels belonging to an enemy country. Later, the US would have plenty of privateers. The War of 1812 and the Revolution relied very heavily on privateers. So a privateer crew was profit motivated. So the owners of the ship might be the captain. It might also be a group of investors, often a group of investors, and they would set up a contract ahead of time saying how they would divide the profits between, from the most lowly sailor to the owners of the ship. It was all laid out in a contract. So in January of 1744, as this war breaks out, Captain Gruchy from Jersey and 2 of the church wardens and 3 other Christchurch members pool their money, and they purchase a ship called the Queen of Hungary, which is a 12-gun sloop. The sources conflict a little bit. The best information I can find is that it was a 12-gun sloop. And so this picture I have up is of from the 2016 Harbor Fest, and this ship was meant to be rigged out like a privateer. It was meant to be a reproduction privateer sloop. So this is as close as I could find to a picture of the Queen of Hungary, which is the name of this ship. So Grushie captains the Queen of Hungary, and their privateering is quite profitable. They make several captures in 1744, and so the investors, which are, again, a lot of the folks are members of Old North Church, make a very tidy profit, get a little bit of wealth under their belts. So Grushie at that point buys the estate of Sir William Phipps, which I find a little bit of irony in. Grushie is buying this estate of Phipps with money that he earned attacking Spanish and French ships, and Phipps bought it with money he earned by raising silver from Spanish ships. So a little bit of a parallel there. So the next year, 1745, they're also very successful in their cruise, and now we have Grushie and his fellow investors want to make a gift to their church. So there's a record, a vestry record from 1746 that says, whereas Mr. Robert Jenkins, Captain Gruchy, Mr. Hugh McDaniels, Mr. John Gould, Mr. John Baker, owners of the privateer Queen of Hungary, have made a hath made a present to Christ Church in Boston of 4 cherubs and 2 glass branches taken by the said vessel. Voted that the branches be hung up in the body of the church and the cherubs placed on the top of the organ. So here are a couple of close-ups of 2 of the 4 cherubs that are still on or around the organ today. The branches in that quote, that refers to 2 chandeliers, which were recently returned to Old North from a church out in Otis, that I think I've heard are going to be put into the narthex at the church. But the cherubs have been there ever since they were captured from a ship that was on its way to French Canada by our Captain Gruchy. But contrary to public opinion or popular opinion, contrary to what a North End tour guide might tell you, they weren't a pirate's booty. Privateering was a perfectly legal occupation. They weren't smuggled into Boston. They were very publicly gifted to Old North Church. They had nothing to do with the tunnels in the North End. So people mix up Captain Gruchy, the cherubs, and the tunnels all into one story in their minds because along with the Phipps mansion, not long after that, Grushie also bought a distillery right at the corner of Henchman and Lynn Street, so right where the tunnels would eventually get rediscovered. And he uses this as a distillery, and he's distilling molasses into rum. He ends up not being a successful businessman, not being nearly as successful as a distiller as he was as a privateer. By 1758, he's deep in debt, couldn't pay his taxes, couldn't pay his creditors, seems to have sold off his house and his assets in 1758, and then left Boston in 1759. This is another thing that sort of gets fuzzy in the historical record. People say that there's a great mystery around the departure of Captain Gruchy. I don't think anything too mysterious happened. I just don't think he wrote down where he was going. So some people say, some historians say that he may have gotten passage on the ship Susanna in January 1759 that went to Halifax. Some say that he turned back up in Jersey. Grushie is a very, very common surname in Jersey, so I'm not a good enough genealogical researcher to confirm either of those theories. Either way, in June of that year, June 1759, the vestry, there was a vestry meeting at Christ Church where they voted that since Captain Gruchy was broke and gone, they were going to resell his pew. So they say, the pew number 25, lately belonging to Captain Thomas James Grushie and purchased by the warden of the church, be conveyed over to Captain Daniel Malcolm, title given to him for it, repaying the warden £8 lawful money which he gave for it. Which I include just because I think it's a little funny that there are so many tales of smuggling tied up with the cherubs, with the tunnels, with Captain Grushie, and who gets his box pew at Old North but Daniel Malcolm, who probably was a smuggler, almost certainly was a smuggler, and has one of the most famous headstones at Copp's Hill, which you can see the musket ball dents in it from some British target practice. So that brings us to this fellow. So Grushie's name is all over the tunnels. So again, if we go back to Dan's email on my very first slide, we heard about, he was asking where could he get a guided tour of Grushie's secret tunnels. But like we just saw, there's little to no evidence tying Grushie to the tunnels, except that we know he owned a plot of land at the corner of Henchman and Lynn, where the tunnels would be uncovered eventually. So this gentleman you see on your screen is an independent researcher named Richard Dean, and he has an 150-page manuscript, unpublished, where he lays out what he believes to be the true origins of the North End Tunnel. And he is, as far as I can tell, done more research on the topic than anybody alive right now. When he was in his 20s, he was working as a bookbinder in Cambridge, and he heard this, our old friend Edward Rowe Snow, of questionable historic bent, but he heard him on the radio talking about the pirate tunnels in the North End. And he says he got obsessed. He was like monomaniacal thinking about the North End tunnels. He spent years going through archives. And this is, I do almost all my research in online archives. He was going to physical archives back in the olden days. And he was looking for evidence about where the tunnel came from. So he's posing there with a 1714 deed that he says reveals the origin of the tunnels. So this is a deed for a parcel of land that is right on Lynn Street, and it in the document it describes the boundaries of the parcel of land that's being sold. It goes from Lynn Street to a well to the property line of a family named the Farrens, who I couldn't tell if they were renting or had bought from Samuel Sewell. And then it describes, as always, all that arch under the highway or street, lying between said granted premises and the said Farren's dwelling house, he the said Farren always maintaining the highway over the same, the arch, according as the town grant to Mr. Henchman. So this is kind of the bombshell of the origins of the tunnel. So Mr. Henchman here is going to be Captain Daniel Henchman, who immigrated to Boston in 1666, worked at first as a school teacher, and he first signed a deed for land at the foot of Copp's Hill in 1669. Excuse me, while I leave you on that cliffhanger, I gotta drink of water for my voice. So after not that many years in Boston, he goes off, he fights in King Philip's War. He'll be one of the first English settlers of what's today Worcester. So he has a son who's also named Daniel Henchman. His son goes on to be a bookbinder and bookseller, which I think for Mr. Dean was a nice parallel, having worked as a bookbinder when he first became interested in this topic. So Dean also says, and I haven't, again, his research is good. I don't know the sourcing on this part, but he says that his research indicates that the elder henchman, so the first Daniel Henchman, was a brewer of beer. And so according to Richard Dean's theory, the tunnel was built for brewing, lagering, essentially beer, and transporting it. So lagering, you have a slow acting yeast, you want it to be a very cold temperature, so you put it underground before electric refrigeration. One more time with the drink for my voice. So I think this is the most convincing explanation of where the tunnels came from. And it fits with something that Porter said, which was, it should be said that other arches not unlike this, though smaller, have been known at the North End, and some can still be pointed out, but they're generally supposed to have been wine vaults or milk cellars. So in both those cases, it's the same ideas as lagering, right? You go underground like a root cellar, like a beer lager, because that's where the cool air is, underground. So it seems that Captain Henchman built an arch similar to other residents' wine cellars, but he built it on a much larger scale because he had a commercial beer brewing business. So, go back to our illustration. So the early accounts, we saw this from Shaw and Porter. They say that the tunnel was as wide as the house. And then we go back to our articles from 1896 and 1906, both say that the remaining tunnels that were visible at the time were 5 feet high and 14 feet wide. So the thing we're left with there, it's impossible to build a 14-foot wide tunnel in secret. These aren't secret tunnels. So even as far back as Shaw in 1817, he was noting the same thing. Tunnel couldn't be done in secret. He says, it has been conjectured that it was designed for a retreat for certain pirates who are said to have infested this coast. Interesting setup. When constructed, the whole street must have been laid open, so that it's not probable its first design could have been for that purpose, the arch being complete and the whole in good order. Okay, so it's very clear that it's built in the open, the whole street's laid open to do this. Henchman is the first person to develop this little corner of the north end, so he was able to have the whole street open because he built the street, basically. So the street probably came after the tunnel. Drake notes in 1873 that the lane is named after the so Henchman Street is named after Captain Henchman. He says, before it was built into a thoroughfare, Lynn Street was only a narrow way around the beach. Henchman's Lane is coeval with Lynn Street and receiving its name, which was from Captain Daniel Henchman, the father of the bookseller. So we know where the tunnels were. We know who built the tunnels, and we think we know what they were used for. So where does that leave our friend Dan, who wanted a guided tour? Well, Dan would have had better luck in the 19th century. So going back to our 1896 Globe story about the North End subway, this is in 1896 talking about somebody who had an experience about 20 years before. So it's an experience in the 1870s. It says, Andrew Hines, who lived on Commercial Street for over 40 years and half that time at 452, went into it being the North End subway. He went into it some 20 years ago. His curiosity was excited by the tales of some of the older residents of the neighborhood, which sounds familiar. We've had that in the North End Waterfront blog, in the Folklorist. Everybody's talking to an older resident. He determined to see for himself where the passage led to. Fixing a miner's light on his hat, he started in, not without some fear. Found no difficulty in getting along. After crossing Commercial Street, he was obliged to stoop a little, as the water had carried sand from above and raised the original bottom. He found the brickwork as clean as the day it was laid, along the sides and the top. He continued his explorations until he reached, as well as he could judge, a point under Charter Street. Seeing no end to the subway in sight and the light of his lamp beginning to grow dim, he retreated. Okay. So since 1896, the tunnel has been reduced again and again and again. So in that same 1896 article, the Globe talks about how little is remaining. They say, when Commercial Street was widened some years ago, the mysterious passage was discovered, but the workmen neglected to investigate it and filled it up. They filled up the passage almost to the north side of Commercial Street. A space about 15 feet long, opening into the cellar of 452 Commercial, remains open. All right, so that's 1896. In 1906, there's a wire story that describes that even that 15-foot long section was blocked off. So in November 1906, when this is written, you can see this remaining section, but it's about to be gone forever. So the house that was formerly known as number 453 Commercial Street in Boston was demolished recently. And upon its site is the front sidewalk of a large brick building, blah, 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 blah. Beneath this sidewalk, in what was formerly the cellar of 453, is the water's end of what was a real smuggler's tunnel. Well, editor's note, not actually real. A simple and unconventional mortar bed now covers the portal of this mystery of nearly 2 centuries, and it very likely will be many years before the smuggler's tunnel will come to light again. Well, that is true. It was many years before the so-called smuggler's tunnel came to light again. It was 1972. Richard Dean was doing more than just digging through archives, looking for evidence of the tunnel's builders. He was also trying to get permission to dig for the tunnels, which I have some photos he shared with me. So he described, I just talked to him for the first time recently. I've quoted from him before without actually speaking. I just spoke with him for the first time recently. And he shared these photos. He described 2 digs in 1972. And so what we're looking at here are images from his first one. So he says he dug down through the sidewalk on Commercial Street and he hit a brick archway that was against a stone wall. So you can see one of his friends down in his exploratory pit, and then you can see in the left picture a brick archway. So exciting. I'm sure he was incredibly excited, but it was a false alarm. If you look at that picture closely, you can see the bricks are way too new to be a 17th century archway. They're probably 19th century bricks. But he was undeterred. His next dig was inside the fence at the Coast Guard base with permission to be inside the fence. And this time he thinks that he hit the real deal. There was a broad archway made of what seemed to be 17th century bricks. They're larger than modern bricks. They're handmade and they're lighter in color than most of our modern bricks. So if you look at the illustration here, you can see the bottom is a photo showing his excavation, and then the brick archway poking through, and then there's a pencil illustration of what he thinks it would look like it was fully excavated. And I don't want to borrow too heavily from his material, so there's a lot more available on his Facebook page, which we can check out after the fact if we want to. So to recap, where does this leave us? As far as I can tell, there's only solid evidence for one tunnel of any size in the north end. There are archways and things in various period houses, probably uses as crude refrigeration, wine cellars and the like. The secret tunnel was not a secret. It was dug in the open with perfect brickwork and then buried. Official documents record the tunnel's existence, the responsibility of maintenance for it. So even in 1714, which was probably about almost a half century after it was dug, people are very aware of this tunnel's existence, and it's being written into deeds as something that needs to be kept up. So then generations go by, it stops being used actively. So when it's disused, it gets forgotten. Then 100 plus years later, construction uncovers it, and then it's periodically rediscovered. And every time it's rediscovered, people get interested, and then especially right around the time of the subway construction and the controversy around the underground world of the subway really sparks the public imagination around the North End Tunnel. And so then you have all these fresh stories being published around the time of the subway construction. The stories, centuries of stories, build upon one another. They create this legend of the tunnels in the North End. But it is just a legend, although it is a legend with a kernel of truth to it. So I'm going to open it up for questions in just a second here. Catherine is going to share out some sources, some additional materials. Also go to hubhistory.com/tunnel, which is the posting for we did a podcast on this topic about a year or two ago. So that has all the sources I used in preparing that podcast episode that you can peruse as well. And make sure to subscribe to the podcast to get more stories like this and other stuff. So I'm going to take down my slides and put my pretty face back up here.
So thank you so much. That was fascinating. And I have to say, the chat box has been very active while you've been talking, remembering the big dig and worrying about the tunnel, rats at the tunnels. And I learned, having blithely told you that, no, I had never heard about a tunnel on Old North. I've learned from one of my colleagues that yes, there is some sort of tunnel in the gift shop, which is 1918 building, and some sort of excavation in a parish house, which is a late 19th century building. So we can surmise that perhaps they were too used for some sort of refrigeration or storage, but who knows? So I would like to open this up for questions. We do have one already that says, in the picture you shared of Snow pointing at an arch, is he standing in Old North's crypt? Because if not, it looks similar to the sealed up tombs at Old North. Could that be the origin of the legend that the tombs link up to the tunnels?
Yeah, let me go back to that photo. Let me pull that back up. I'm just paging back through my slides. It's back here in the deck of ways. Here we go. Let me throw this back up. So Edward Rowe Snow is not in the crypts here. He is, you can see in the captioning there, the Dodd Mansion, which I think, if I have looked at everything correctly, is a vacant lot right now on Salem Street, just almost across from the parish house.
Okay.
And that's the same, little bit different perspective, but the same arch that you can see in the black and white photo. So if you look at, it's taken from a little bit more of an angle, and you can see sort of that bulging protuberance, I guess, out of the side of the wall. So that you can see is a little bit different. The background arch looks a little bit more like what you might see in Old North's crypts, but the one in the foreground that Snow is leaning up against is a little bit different configuration.
Any other questions? Let's see, we have, that's the one with the souvenir shop. I've heard there's a tunnel entrance there. How old are the Gruchy cherubs?
So the Grushie cherubs are quite old, because they were not new when they were hijacked from the French in 1745. They are probably from the 17th century, like mid to late 17th century. They're quite old. I think now, I don't have notes on this in front of me, but maybe the Old North folks can remind me. I think they were in a church in France, and they were destined for a church in Canada. So it's not like they were newly made for the Canadian church. They had already been used in a church in France for some period of decades.
Our understanding is they're about 100 years older than the church.
There we go.
23, and that they were on their way to some convent in what is now Quebec when they were borrowed. Privateered.
Yeah, privateering was a perfectly legitimate business back then.
Exactly. We have someone reporting that the church they were supposed to go to supposedly has tour guides who complain about the theft. Our guys are there in Love and War. So there we go.
I hope that's true.
Any other questions? Well, I love the fact that, like many good things, the solution goes back to beer. And, and that's, I guess, where we are going to be leaving it tonight. I do want to let everyone know that, yes, we've recorded it. So I know that a few people had problems with power going out in the middle of this. So we can make the recording available to anyone who lost any portion of the lecture tonight. If you have further questions, I'm sure that we can relay them to Jake, and he will answer them if he can. I will be sending out tomorrow morning a survey for you all with some of the resources that have been used and referred to here. But once again, I want to thank you, Jake. This was so much fun. It was so interesting. And it's such a conversation that people love to have. So
well,
we're just getting a lot of thank yous in the chat box.
I just saw somebody scroll by that said they were a podcast listener. Thanks for listening.
Ah.
Everybody else should sign up. We tell all kinds of stories like this.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, everybody. And well, the vice presidential debate starts in 50 minutes. So you have time to prepare yourselves for that. Oh, we have someone who just signed up for the podcast. So thank you all again for being with us. Thank you for supporting Old North. And I hope that I'll see some of you in November, if not all of you, at our next speaker series. So have a good night, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.